In this lecture, we're going to introduce environmental economics. The economy plays a key role in how humans interact with the environment, so we have a whole series of videos that look at how certain aspects of the economy make it challenging for us to manage natural resources in any sort of sustainable way. The purpose of this lecture is to give you a basic introduction to set the stage for the overall discussion on environmental economics. We have looked at the relationship between societal values, which are represented by the dominant social paradigm, and institutions that determine how our societies function. I presented you with this quote from Young that nicely highlights the distinction between institutions and organizations. So when we think about the economy in this framework, examples of organizations are businesses, producers, service providers, sellers, buyers, and consumers. The institutions are the rules that determine how these players interact with each other in our economy. Now, it's necessary to realize that the rules of the economy are not natural laws that have been given to us by the universe. Instead, the rules of economics are a human construct, and they have emerged from within our societies over the centuries and millennia, ever since people have started trading stuff. And the rules that we follow today are the cumulative result of this evolution in the context of our values and our worldviews. Now, since the activities of our economy all require resources and produce waste, the rules of the economy have far-reaching consequences on how we interact with the environment. Economics is the social science that studies the rules of our economic system. Economics aims to better understand the factors that drive the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services, and how these factors interact with each other, how we can influence them to get better results. Environmental ethics is a subfield of economics that is concerned with the components of the economy that interface directly with the environment and where environmental challenges emerge. Some of the key topics that environmental economists are concerned about include market failures, which are market situations that lead to non-optimal use of resources. They're interested in how to measure wealth and prosperity in a meaningful way that can help promote sustainable use. How to value ecosystem services in some sort of economic framework. And also, environmental economists are interested in how to change our economic system to encourage a more sustainable future. So over the next few lectures, we're going to look at introductions into a selected number of these topics. In this lecture, I will explain the basic characteristics of the free market to set the stage for the future discussions. But to give you the bigger picture, here are the goals for this first set of videos. So by the end of these lectures, you'll be able to describe the basic characteristics of the free market, identify different property rights, and I want you to be able to understand the concepts of excludability and depletability and how they result to market failures for different types of environmental goods and services. I also want you to be able to explain the key types of market failures with respect to global environmental issues. These sorts of issues include open access issues, the free rider problem with public goods, the problems with externalities, and we will also touch briefly on what are known as perverse subsidies. So let's get started. One of the dominant economic paradigms of our time is the free market economy. The free market economy is an economic system where the prices for goods and services are set by the forces of supply and demand without any government intervention. This means that the government does not have any say in how cheap or how expensive things are. In such an economic system, companies and products are privately owned, and we have competitive markets where producers and sellers compete for buyers and clients. Now, what do we mean when we talk about a market? A market is a place or a platform that enables buyers and sellers of specific goods or services to come together and make transactions. An obvious example that might come to mind is a farmer's market, where you have farmers who want to sell their produce and people like you and I who want to buy that produce. But there are many other examples of markets, such as the housing market, the stock exchange, or even online platforms where we buy things over the internet. Now, as we discussed before, in a free market, the transactions between buyers and sellers are driven by the relationship between supply and demand without any government intervention. Now, most of us have heard or have discussed the ideas of supply and demand. But what the challenge is that now most real markets are not completely free. There is typically some level of government control, but it is nevertheless a good model for the general characteristics of the markets in our economic system. Let's look at how free markets, as they're known, are ideally supposed to work. Once we can understand that, we can then look at situations where these supposedly free markets fail and result in unintended and undesirable outcomes. We're going to look at the producers or the supplier side first. Let's assume that you are a farmer and you are growing both tomatoes and carrots. The production of each of these vegetables is associated with some cost, and you have to decide how best to use your personal resources. In other words, how much of your time and your money you should invest in growing tomatoes, and how much of that your time and your money you should put into growing carrots. Now, obviously, this is going to depend on how much money you can make from selling tomatoes or carrots. If you can make a lot of money from tomatoes, you'll probably focus most, if not all, of your resources on growing tomatoes. But if you cannot get a good price for your tomatoes, then you'd be better off on focusing on your carrot production. So the questions you have to ask as a producer are, given a market price for tomatoes, how many tomatoes am I willing to produce? The answer to this question is what's known as the supply curve. On this chart, you see the quantity of a product along the x-axis at the bottom and its price of this product on the y-axis on the left. The green line represents the supply curve that describes what combination of price and quantities are acceptable to the suppliers. If the supplier or the producer only gets a little bit of money for their tomatoes, they will only produce a very few number and use the rest of their resources for growing something else. If the producers can get a higher price for their tomatoes, they will grow more. The exact number doesn't really matter. It's the general pattern that we're going to look at. So this is the supplier or the producer side. Let's take a look at the buyer or the consumer side. This is a situation that we're all much more familiar with, as we all need to buy groceries, and we all want to make the most of our limited grocery budgets. To stay with the theme that we're talking about here, let's imagine that you like tomatoes. So when you go to the grocery store, the question you have to ask yourself is, given the current market price for tomatoes, how many am I willing to buy? If the tomatoes are cheap, you will buy lots of tomatoes and make a tomato salad or put them in pasta or can them. If the tomatoes are expensive, you'll only buy a few and use the rest of the money for something else that you can get better value from. The relationship between the price of a good and how much you are willing to buy of that good is described by the demand side curve, and that's shown on this slide with the blue line. The chart has exactly the same axes as we just looked at before, but this time the curve is sloping down towards the right. The higher the price of tomatoes, the fewer you're going to buy. Okay, so this is all pretty straightforward so far. We have a supply curve that we talked about before that represents the supplier's preference for how many tomatoes they're willing to grow, and we have the demand side curve here that describes how many tomatoes you're interested in buying given different prices. Now, if we put these two curves together on the same chart, we can say something about the price of tomatoes in the overall market. In a free market, the actual price of a good is at the intersection of the demand and supply curves. The price is called the equilibrium price, and it is the price where the supply is produced is exactly the same as the quantity that's demanded by the consumer at the price they are willing to pay. What's interesting about this equilibrium price is that it is an attractor. Now, I hope you remember the concept of an attractor from our discussion on planetary boundaries and resilience. The fact that the equilibrium price is an attractor means that regardless of what sales price you start at, the price will always end up at the equilibrium level. Let's look at a scenario where suppliers are initially planning with a price to offer the product at a price that is much higher than the equilibrium price. In this case, say they're producing a lot of tomatoes at this red dot on the supply curve, but the customers are only willing to pay a price back here on the demand curve. So along the x-axis, the price that the suppliers are offering at is quite high, and then along the x-axis moving to the left, that shows the red dot on the demand curve that the consumers are willing to pay. So what this means is we have a big surplus of tomatoes. The difference between what the producers want to produce and what price they want to produce, and what the price they want to get for it, and what the demand is for those tomatoes. So this could lead to tremendous waste. So what normally happens in these situations? The price of the good that is overabundant goes down. So the price of something that's overabundant goes down, and the suppliers adjust their practices to produce fewer tomatoes at a lower price. At the same time, the lower price entices consumers to buy more tomatoes, and therefore we end up with a smaller surplus. So this downward adjustment of price and quantity will continue until we reach the equilibrium price, where the suppliers produce exactly the amount of tomatoes that the consumers demand at the price they are willing to pay. So the sequence of events is this. The initial price is higher than the equilibrium price, which results in a surplus that makes suppliers unhappy. As a consequence, the price goes down, which makes the suppliers produce less and the consumers to buy more. The price continues to fall until we reach the equilibrium price, where the surplus has disappeared. And at this point, both the suppliers and the consumers are happy because the producers get to sell and the consumers get to buy as many tomatoes as each of them want at the right price. Interestingly, this also works when we approach the equilibrium price from below, but the sides are reversed. If the expected price is below the equilibrium price, the consumers want to buy a lot, but the suppliers will only produce a little. In this case, we'll end in a shortfall, and the buyers are unhappy because there are not enough tomatoes. With the demand being higher than the supply, the price naturally goes up, which makes the suppliers produce more and the consumers to buy less. This does reduce the existing shortage, but the price has to go all the way up to the equilibrium price to reach the balance between supply and demand. So regardless of what price we start at, we always end up at the equilibrium price, where the suppliers are producing exactly as much as the buyers demand, and the buyers buy it at a price that makes it worthwhile for the suppliers. At this equilibrium point, everybody in the market is content, and we don't have any waste. A fancier way of saying this is that the situation of all the resources have been allocated or are used effectively, and we have produced the biggest social welfare, i.e. the most happiness, at the lowest possible cost. For the equilibrium price dynamic to unfold like this, a number of conditions have to be fulfilled. First, we need to have a large number of buyers and sellers, and the market needs to be competitive. In other words, there cannot be a monopoly or any price fixing. If I don't like the price of one supplier, I need to have the opportunity to go to another supplier. Second, everybody needs to have perfect information about the product and its current and future price. This ensures that everyone can make fully informed decisions about what and how much of each thing they want to sell or buy. Thirdly, everybody involved in this market needs to act rationally. In this context, being rational means that everybody focuses on their own interests and tries to maximize their own benefit or utility. So suppliers are only focused on their bottom line and their happiness, and consumers try to make the most out of their grocery budget. They focus on their bottom line. The fourth condition is that has to be fulfilled is that the price of the good has to accurately reflect the full cost of the production and consumption of the good. There cannot be any freebies or costs that are not accounted for. And the last condition is that the inputs needed for the production of the goods are produced need to be divisible and individually owned. This means that the goods can be divided into sellable chunks, and somebody has to actually own them and be there to sell them. In situations where all of these conditions are fulfilled, the free market provides an amazing mechanism to use the limited resources of a society in an optimal way. As you saw in the example I presented, regardless of where we start, we always end up at the equilibrium price, where everybody gets what they want at a price that is meaningful for them without any waste. Economists say that in this situation, the resources are allocated efficiently. The price of a good or service plays an essential role in the system because that price communicates information about scarcity and provides the necessary incentives for using the goods or services in the most productive way. This was actually Julian Simmons' argument in the techno-optimist versus the techno-pessimist debate. An interesting characteristic of the free market is that even though all the actors, so all the suppliers and all the consumers, because all these actors act only in their own self-interest, in the end, the forces of the free market produce a situation where the benefit or the welfare of the entire society is maximized. So everybody is just looking out for their own. But in the end, the sum of all these self-absorbed actions actually produces the best outcome for the society as a whole. This emerging characteristic of the free market is commonly referred to as the invisible hand. Now, the challenge is that all of this only works when all of the conditions that we listed are fulfilled. And even then, it is an idealized model of how the economy works. As we will learn in some of the upcoming lectures, not all of these conditions are fulfilled when we deal with natural resources. And this, in turn, leads to serious environmental problems. One of these conditions is that the supplies used and the goods produced need to be individually owned and divisible. In our next lecture, we will continue this discussion by looking at different types of ownerships in more detail.